Hi everybody, Dr. Ahles here. In this short video, we're going to explore the different kinds of chemical reactions that your body uses in this big picture process called metabolism, which is all of the chemical reactions that help you to stay alive. When we talk about chemical reactions, in general, what you should know about them is that it's all about those bonds. Let's underline, highlight, star bonds. Remember that chemical bonds are what hold two things together. When they share electrons, when they steal electrons, this is what helps us to make those bigger molecules from the smaller parts. Now, when we do chemical reactions, we're always going to have reactants, which is what we start with, and products, which is what we end with. Depending on the kind of chemical reaction, sometimes the products are bigger than the reactants. Other kinds of reactions will have reactants that are bigger than the products. So it all comes down to the different kind of chemical reaction that's occurring. There are three main kinds of chemical reactions that we're going to explore together in this video. The first kind is called a synthesis reaction. In a synthesis reaction, we synthesize or build something that's bigger than what we started with. So the products are larger than the reactants, like we see in our picture up here. We can also do the opposite though. We can do what's called decomposition. When we do decomposition, we break down or decompose what we started with. So larger reactants, smaller products. The final kind of chemical reaction that we're going to explore is exchange reactions. And in an exchange reaction, different molecules are exchanging parts with each other. It's kind of a combination of a synthesis reaction and a decomposition reaction all in one. So let's start with synthesis reactions. When we do a synthesis reaction, if we're looking at this in terms of those chemical bonds, in a synthesis reaction, we build chemical bonds. You'll also see this word come up in future classes of anabolism, or having an anabolic reaction. When we build something bigger than we started with, when we do a synthesis reaction, this is called anabolism, building. So when we put this in cartoon structures, we see reactant A, reactant B coming together to form this chemical bond, building us a product that's bigger than either of those reactants. In the human body, we would see this with things like sugars, for example. Building together sugars in a long line, or building together amino acids in a protein. Big idea with synthesis reactions, we start with something small, we get something big. The opposite is decomposition reactions. Remember that in decomposition reactions, we're breaking things down. Something started big and it gets much smaller. The other word for decomposition reactions is catabolism. Catabolism means the same thing as breaking apart chemical bonds. So again, with our cartoon, if we take that large reactant, AB, that we made above, and we split it in half into A and B, we've just done decomposition. And we do this all the time in the body when we have stored sugar, like we see up here, and we break it into individual pieces. That's a decomposition reaction, or that is a catabolic reaction. Synthesis and decomposition are often paired in the body. So what we're looking at right now, let's go ahead and underline, highlight, star peptide bond. Peptide bond. We're highlighting this because this tells me what I'm looking at is a protein. Proteins are built out of individual amino acids. And when I pull them together, I make a thing called a peptide bond. So building a peptide bond is a particular kind of synthesis reaction. We call it a dehydration synthesis reaction because what we do to connect these two amino acids is we steal a molecule of water. Now, technically, it's not water as we pull it off, we turn it into water. So we take an OH from one amino acid, we take an H from another, put them together, get H2O, and a peptide bond. But when we need to recycle proteins in the body, we're not going to want to do dehydration synthesis. What we're going to want to do is what's called hydrolysis. Now, hydrolysis is a form of decomposition reaction. This particular decomposition reaction, the way that I break down the bond is by adding water across each side. So one amino acid gets a hydrogen, one amino acid gets an OH. Big picture, when we look at these two types of chemical reactions, we want to know that they're opposites of each other and that they are building something if we're doing synthesis or breaking something down if we're doing decomposition. Because that brings us to our last kind of chemical reactions, the kind of chemical reactions that involve both breaking something down and building something. So this kind of chemical reaction that we're talking about is an exchange reaction. So if we look at our cartoons, there's two different options for what exchange might look like. Option one is I have a very large reactant and a small one, and I put that small one in, changing the large one. Option number two is two equally sized reactants that just flip-flop with each other what they're connected to at the end. Either way, when we're looking at these kinds of reactions, something is trading places. Now, if we look at actual biochemical examples of this, this is a process that we use in the body for energy transfer. So we're looking at a molecule over here. This colorful molecule is what we call ATP, which we'll talk about a bunch in future videos. But ATP stores a lot of energy. When I break it down or when I do an exchange reaction, I actually take this phosphate group and exchange it over here for a hydrogen. So we end up with what's called a DP and a phosphorylated compound. So exchange reactions, a combination of decomposition and synthesis, we're going to use these in the body very regularly. It ties into this kind of reaction, which is what pretty much everything in your body is, and that's called a redox reaction. So redox reactions include the process of reduction and oxidation. So what those things mean is what's happening to my electrons. In reduction, we're gaining electrons. So a molecule that gets reduced has more electrons than it did at the beginning. But electrons don't just appear out of thin air. Electrons had to come from somewhere. So oxidation is the process of losing electrons. Reduction, the process of gaining electrons. It should be no surprise then, as we talk about these things, that oxidation and reduction have to be paired. Somebody gives away electrons, somebody else gets them. I'm not going to go as in depth with you in our class as asking you, what's the reducing agent or what's the oxidizing agent? But what I will ask you is what happens when the process of oxidation occurs. What happens when oxidation occurs is this molecule loses electrons. It becomes oxidized. It lost electrons. But those electrons don't just disappear. We use them to reduce our other atom. So in this case, we started off with no electrons that are visible, and we ended with 2 of them. Oxidation and reduction, these things are paired. A good way to remember whether we're gaining or losing electrons in these processes, if we lose electrons, that's oxidation. My lion here is named Leo. If we gain electrons, that's reduction. Leo says grr. So whatever way you have to help you keep track of losing or gaining electrons, here's mine. Leo says grr. Helps me to remember that I lose electrons when I'm oxidized. I gain electrons when I'm reduced. Redox reactions are the type of reaction that our body does to help us form ATP. And like I mentioned for you, ATP is our cell's energy money. This is what we need to power our life. So how the redox reactions in metabolism work is we start off with high energy bonds that are found in your foods. So in your carbohydrates or in your lipids. First, I break those bonds. So when I break those bonds, electrons are lost. Something in the body gets oxidized, the food we eat. That allows us to reduce our molecules that form ATP. So ATP comes from a molecule called ADP. When I give it extra electrons, when I reduce it, this allows me to build my energy storage molecule in the body. So when we look big picture at the process of metabolism from beginning to end, when you ingest glucose, when you ingest sugar, we oxidize it, meaning we take away some electrons. That's going to turn into carbon dioxide. But because I lost those electrons from glucose, they have to go somewhere else. And that's where oxygen comes in. When I give oxygen those extra electrons, it's going to grab some hydrogens with them as well. So big picture metabolism, the way all of the chemical reactions in your body work, it's going to be redox reactions. Somebody gains electrons, they're reduced, because somebody lost them, they're oxidized. That's the big picture on chemical reactions in the body.